This is the Comics Alternative, on location at Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative on location. I'm Derek.
And I'm Mike, and we are two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right, and this is the first of what should be two on-location episodes for August at Heroes Aren't Hard to Find in Charlotte, North Carolina. They're located at 417 Pecan Avenue. If you're in the area, if you're visiting Charlotte, you definitely should stop by. That's Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. Well, Mike, I know that we had planned two shows in July, and we actually got the first one on July 4th, a celebratory period, and we had planned, I guess, a couple of weeks later to do the other. Unfortunately, as they say, life got in the way. Listeners will know
very often.
Listeners will know that I've been having issues with my father and his health, and things got a little touch and go there in July. It wasn't a fun month for me, and so we didn't get that second show. But we do plan on two episodes in August, and this is the first.
And we will always have plenty to talk about.
That's right. And just to remind listeners, because we've started this kind of joint co-hosted on-location episode not too long ago. But what Mike and I plan to do on our shows is each of us have one, two, maybe three titles in mind, something quite recent, either that may have come out the week that we're discussing, maybe the week or two before, something that we're interested in. And Mike is usually going to cover the mainstream DC and Marvel. I will probably focus mostly on alternative, or at least the non-DC Marvel publishers. And we'll just go from there. We'll highlight things that we're interested in, and then the conversation will evolve. Anyone who comes into the shop who wants to sit down and talk with us is more than welcome to do so, and that could take the conversation in any number of directions. So we have sort of a plan and a format.
Sort of being the operative term there. Yes.
Yes. But for the most part, it can be freewheeling.
Yes, it's kind of a crisis of infinite genres. As I move forward here in my effort to sort of lower the intellectual caliber of our conversations.
That's a good one, though. I like that. So Mike, what did you want to talk about this week?
Well, one of the things that's really interesting me is the work of Ta-Nehisi Coates for Marvel. Last couple of segments that we've done together, I have largely focused on titles from DC, particularly the work of Tom King, his work on Batman leading up to the, I'm still going to withhold spoilers, though probably no one needs them, sort of kind of marriage of Batman and Catwoman. And I haven't devoted a lot of time to talking about what Marvel is bringing out. I will confess that in terms of my own personal affiliations, I'm much more of a Marvel fan, to kind of quote Stan Lee from many decades ago, make mine Marvel. So I'll try to do some justice to that today, and I'll try to not use too many stock phrases of Stan Lee. As I mentioned, I'm particularly interested in the work of Ta-Nehisi Coates, and today saw the publication of the second issue of Captain America that he's writing, and I think it's fascinating to have a writer of Ta-Nehisi Coates' certainly academic, critical background, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, of course, as an African-American writer, perhaps one of our most important public intellectuals in American life today, not only working in the comics medium and working on a character like Black Panther, and I do want to touch on his work on Black Panther for a little bit as well, but now taking on Captain America, certainly one of the most iconic characters in the history of the superhero genre, and a character who unavoidably has been attached to all kinds of different political meanings and all kinds of different cultural ramifications. So to see Ta-Nehisi Coates take on the character, I think is interesting in and of itself. If you don't know Ta-Nehisi Coates' work, he was for quite a long time a contributing editor to the Atlantic Monthly. Interestingly enough, he recently stepped away from that role And I have to wonder if that is in part because of his increased profile in the comics industry. As we touch on Ta-Nehisi Coates' work with Captain America and, by extension, Black Panther, we're also kind of unavoidably straying into that connection, if in fact there is a connection, between comics and politics. And we've touched on that in the past as well, but Coates, of course, as a prose writer, as a critical writer, someone working for the Atlantic Monthly, doing several books of nonfiction, including his kind of landmark work on connected to the Black Lives Matter movement, Between the World and Me. So it's unavoidable when we have a writer of Ta-Nehisi Coates' caliber working on a character like Captain America and, of course, a character like Black Panther, that there are some kind of political echoes here. Let me back off from this for a moment and talk instead about kind of one of the surprising narrative twists that I see thus far in the two issues he's done of Captain America. As was the case when he was starting up with Black Panther, it seems to be taking a while for the basic narrative to get going. If there's an antagonist so far in the series, it's Captain America fighting against squads of terrorists who are all, I guess we'd say, clones of the character Nuke. All right, get your footnotes out here now. Nuke was a character introduced by Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli in their run on Batman, excuse me. Batman Year One, of course, for that. In their run on Daredevil, back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. He's another sort of super soldier with a flag tattooed on his face, bit of a Rambo character when first introduced, bare-chested and military fatigues, and wielding lots of big guns with ammo strapped around him. Coates has brought this character back, who now apparently has been cloned into various squads of them, and is staging terrorist attacks around the United States. Well, that seems like a fairly typical Marvel plot, a fairly typical Captain America plot. But one of the things that Coates has done that I think makes this more interesting, and I'm curious to see where this goes, is that he has set up this narrative line as very directly a sequel from the very controversial Captain America run and Sam Wilson, the Falcon run by Nick Spencer that led to the crossover Secret Empire. That was incredibly controversial for reasons that seem exaggerated to me, in fact, because Captain America in that storyline had his reality altered and was really an agent of Hydra, and people were up in arms all over the internet. How can the creation of a Jewish writer and a Jewish artist, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, end up being a kind of proto-fascist, as if things like this never happen in the world of comic books, of superhero comic books.
And that was a couple of years ago, wasn't it?
That was a couple of years ago. And Marvel seemed to backtrack from that series once it was concluded with the run that immediately preceded Ta-Nehisi Coates' work, a really entertaining run by Mark Waid, primarily drawn by Chris Samney. Great series of issues, but that was, to use a phrase I mentioned in our last episode, it was a great classic Coke version of Captain America. Mm-hmm. He was back in the pirate boots and back in the regular outfit, nothing that was derived from the way Brian Hitch had redesigned him for the Ultimates, which has been sort of the template for Captain America's costumes for quite some time. And so it seemed as if Marvel was really trying to say, Secret Empire didn't go that well, we're going to wipe it away from the major focus of our narrative. That's not what Ta-Nehisi Coates is doing, and I think he's plunging into the politics of this. It is hard to see exactly how this will play out, but just as Secret Empire, particularly the second half of that storyline, was kind of unavoidably a product of that point in American life when we were transitioning from the Obama to the Trump presidencies. Dare I say that the fascist Captain America used a kind of rhetoric sometimes that seemed distinctly Trumpian. And while he was not separating families and putting children in cages, he was creating internment camps for the Inhumans. And Nick Spencer's run on Captain America and Sam Wilson was a really interesting example for a lot of the run of the way that superhero comics can sometimes, I don't know if I want to say comment on politics, but at least tap into politics. When Sam Wilson replaced Captain America, the tagline for a lot of those issues as people responded to him was, "He's not my Cap." Mm-hmm. In much the way that there was resistance to Obama as the first African-American president. When Captain America sort of surfaced in his Hydra persona, again, a lot of the language, a lot of the rhetoric had a little bit of a Trumpian cast to it. And what's interesting to me is that Ta-Nehisi Coates seems to be picking up on that story. Captain America now is distrusted by much of the public because the country was taken over by a version of himself. But one of the points that Ta-Nehisi Coates makes quite often in the narration, usually, which is a first-person narration coming from Cap's point of view, is that, well, the official storyline is that the American public was subjugated by Hydra and rose up against them. Captain America is actually raising some doubts about that in his narration, that in some ways the actions of Hydra, the choices that were made in policy, the politics of that time, were supported by a certain portion of the public. So that seems to hint at a political direction for the series moving forward. We're also seeing in the second issue of this, I guess this is going to be a spoiler, a little bit of a connection to Black Panther. So it would be interesting to see Ta-Nehisi Coates' particular corner of the Marvel Universe and how that develops. I'm not sure that Ta-Nehisi Coates is a great comic book writer yet. It seems to me that he is still adapting to the medium, and there's a certain static quality to some of the stories with almost obligatory action sequences that are drawn in ways that allow the characters to pose with a big full-page spread or double-page spread. But there's some fascinating ideas here and a fascinating kind of mythology that he's building up. I think one of the things he does that's very interesting in Black Panther, and I'm sure influenced the film adaptation of it, was the way that Coates has built up a very deliberate, very detailed, very involved history, geography, and mythology for Wakanda. And it'll be interesting to see him take those same kind of approaches to Captain America as well. So I think that's exciting and interesting stuff. Captain America is drawn by Lionel Wu, forgive my horrible pronunciation, and that gives it a little bit more of a dynamic feel than some of the issues of Black Panther.
You know, one of the things that you mentioned, I was curious about, because I have to admit, I have not read any of Coates' comics. Not Black Panther, not the beginning now of the Captain America run. One of the things, though, that I'm curious about, and you alluded to this just a second ago, and that is his, I guess, adapting the medium of comics in a way that is perhaps more comfortable, and you're saying that he's still getting, so to speak, his sea legs when it comes to the medium.
I think he is. The issues of Captain America read more quickly and more easily than the early issues of Black Panther. The early issues of Black Panther were fascinating, but they were long, dialogue-dominated pages where characters were discussing political philosophy, which was very interesting in and of itself, but wasn't a kind of characteristic comics reading experience. The Captain America issues thus far are a little bit more dynamic, but I think we're just seeing the plot begin to evolve, and it seems to me that what Coates is doing is kind of trying to find his voice as Captain America.
And I find that interesting in that, we have a long history of writers who are brand new to comics, but maybe who are much more adept in other fields, right?
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, I guess, we had Margaret Atwood writing comics for the first time.
That's right.
Catbird? That series.
I'm not going to be able to pull that one up. Sorry.
Yeah, it's something like that in terms of the title, and I'm sad that I can't exactly remember. Although I do remember seeing the collected Cat Dog or whatever it's called solicited in last month's previews catalog. So there's that, but also entertainers from other fields like music.
Reginald Hudlin, who also wrote Black Panther for a while.
Mm-hmm. Gerard Way, I mean, is a great example.
Absolutely.
And, it seemed to me that Gerard Way, I mean, this is someone who was a musician, then went into writing comics. I don't know. Whenever I read a Gerard Way comic, even his earliest ones, I get a feeling that he slips that on the roll-on like a glove. I mean, it fits really snugly with him. And I felt pretty good about Margaret Atwood. I thought that she did a pretty good job writing. So I was just curious how Coates was as a writer, but you think that he is still evolving into the medium?
On an issue-by-issue basis, I would say yes. What is interesting, and I think we can see this now, he's got about 24 issues of Black Panther now that he's completed, 2 issues of Captain America. He does seem to be working from a grand design, with each 12-issue segment roughly being one narrative arc and the narrative arcs being connected. One of the things that also surprises me as well is how deeply knowledgeable he is about Marvel history and the references that he's making to previous storylines with different characters, bringing in obscure characters into the series, and I'm drawing a blank now on a single example of that. I think he was a big X-Men fan, so there are X-Men villains whom I don't recognize because I didn't follow those titles for a long, long time, that he seems to be bringing in. So he has serious credentials as a longtime comics reader and fan, and I think is still exploring how the medium works. I'd say the phenomenon of writers like Coates and Margaret Atwood and Gerard Way writing comics is an example as well of just the increasing cultural legitimacy and cultural prestige even of comics as a form. So we're in a very different world now.
Yeah, that's a good point. So now, how long will Coates be on Captain America? Is it just for a particular arc, or is it indeterminate at this point?
It seems to be indeterminate. I have not read anything that indicates that it's just 12 issues.
Oh, okay.
It feels like it is building in a fairly big way. But that's only 2 issues in.
Yeah. Well, let me go ahead and bring up a couple of comics that I wanted to emphasize, and both of these are Image releases, and both of them are linked to a previous Image series that I particularly enjoyed, and that was Chew. For fans of Chew, you know that John Layman was the writer, Rob Guillory was the artist, and they just, I think, had a phenomenal run with that series. Are you familiar with Chew? Did you read any of Chew?
I'm afraid I'm not. Yeah.
Oh, it's really, really fun. And each of them, Guillory and then Layman, have recently come out with comics of their own, new comics. Now, back in July, Rob Guillory published the first issue of The Farmhand, which is a new Image series that he is writing and illustrating. And then just today, as we record this, August 1st, the first issue of John Layman and Nick Pitarra's Leviathan is coming out. And one of the things that both of these titles have in common is the humor that you can find in Chew. Now, I really do enjoy both of these titles. I have to say that between the two, The Farmhand right now seems more promising, and for this reason. There seems to be more that went on in the first issue of The Farmhand than there was that went on in the first issue of Leviathan, although the first issue of Leviathan was really fun. Now, the premise of Leviathan, or what goes on in this first issue, and I don't think I'm going to be in any kind of spoiler territory, it concerns whom I guess will be the protagonist, a guy named Ryan DeLuca. And he is having several people over to his house just to hang out, drink beer and whatnot. He goes to his fridge. He realizes, I don't have any beer. And so he calls up his friend Johnny Burns, and the two of them go out to a market, and they're looking for a place that's open where they can get more beer. It's almost midnight, so they want to make sure that they get to a place and get some beer so they can bring it back to the apartment. While they are out in the city, all of a sudden this gigantic creature materializes in the out of nowhere. And right before this happens,
it was always a dream of mine that those things would in fact happen.
Yeah, well, it happens in this first issue of Leviathan. And right before this creature appears, someone by the name of Hobo Jenkins, who is a street guy. I don't know why they call him Hobo. He's not a hobo. He's more of a homeless guy. But anyway, Hobo Jenkins comes up and he starts spouting off that, the world's going to end, something bad's going to happen, death is, at the door. And then right then, this creature materializes. And this is the titular Leviathan. And then this creature goes around, starts destroying things. The creature makes its way, interestingly enough, to Ryan's apartment, and Ryan's apartment is where Ryan's heartthrob, his girlfriend, is, and he has plans to pretty soon propose to her. So, of course, he freaks out. The Leviathan goes and starts destroying things, and that's basically what we have in the first issue. So there's not much that goes on. I guess it lays down the premise. There's another character called Father Gabriel Barron, and he seems to recognize what this creature is, and he actually is the one who gives it the name Leviathan. He said, it is the Leviathan. And so I'm curious to see what role Father Barron will play, and then along with that, Hobo Jenkins. I mean, these seem to be minor characters. But Ryan seems to be the protagonist here. His girlfriend, Vivian, we don't know exactly what happens to her at the end. Does she meet her demise? Does she not? We don't know for certain. Another possibility, or one possibility of where this Leviathan came from, there's one guest at Ryan's apartment that he doesn't really like. Okay, it's someone named Goth Jimmy. So these names in names. Leviathan, are great.
Hobo Jenkins, Goth Jimmy. Yeah,
that's right. Good. So apparently Goth Jimmy was doing something at the apartment, doing some kind of ceremony, doing some chants. And so there's the possibility that whatever Goth Jimmy was doing at Ryan's apartment is what brought this Leviathan to form, and maybe why the Leviathan is finding its way to Ryan's apartment. We don't know. So there are a lot of unanswered questions. But they're kind of good unanswered questions. One of the things we discussed on this week's episode, or the most current episode of the Comics Alternative, the regular review show, we looked at 5 recent number ones. And Paul and I were trying to gauge whether the number one issues were successful or not, according to various criteria. And one criteria is, how many questions does this first issue leave us, and are they the good kind of questions? In other words, are they questions that will have us wanting to come back for the second and third issue and just continue reading on, or are things so ambiguous in this first issue, are readers so confused that they may throw their hands up and go, I don't understand what's going on, I don't know if I want to go ahead on to the second issue?
I think the first issue of a series now, whether it's a mainstream title or an independent title, although I suspect mainstream titles, when they're using recognizable characters, or have this a little bit more easy, is, can that be a satisfying read in and of itself? Mm-hmm. Since comics now are almost always created to be collected later into graphic novels, can a single issue be a satisfying read in and of itself?
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, I think that whether it be ongoing series or mini-series, that the appreciation or the enjoyment of a first issue is automatically going to be linked to what comes next. Right. And so if you take that as a given, then for me at least the question becomes, in what ways might this first issue, to put it in your words, kind of sort of stand on its own? Maybe not completely stand on its own, but sort of stand on its own. Maybe raise a number of questions, but again, the kind of good questions that get you to want to read the second issue in order to find answers to those questions.
Is there a satisfying and compelling sequence in that first issue that provides enough entertainment in and of itself to
exactly, and
to make that feel like more than just a small piece of a narrative.
Yeah, and 2 of the number one issues that Paul and I looked at on the most recent episode of the podcast, the regular review show, we looked at The Seeds, which is coming out. It's a Berger book imprint from Dark Horse, and then Euthanauts, which is the latest Black Crown title from IDW. And both of those issues raised a lot of questions. and were in some ways kind of ambiguous. But I think Paul and I agreed that with the seeds, those were kind of what I was calling the good kind of questions, the good kind of ambiguity that get us wanting to, go to the second issue and then the third issue. Euthonauts, it's a fascinating premise. However, I think the way that the story was told in the first issue was confusing to the point that I've more or less made the decision that if I'm going to continue reading this, I'm just going to wait for the trade. So I'm not going to read it on a week-by-week basis because I'm not convinced that it's going to be a satisfying enough read. And maybe I'm not giving Teenie Howard, the writer of Euthonauts, enough credit. I mean, maybe I should stick around for the second issue and see if I feel better about it. And I might if I have the time. But I use those as examples of whether we have a first issue that is satisfying enough and at the same time kind of substantive enough. Now, getting back to Leviathan, there doesn't seem to be much that's happening, and so one might think that there's not much substance in this first issue. But I tell you, one of the saving graces, if you want to put it that way, of Leviathan #1 is Nick Pitarra's art, which is just phenomenal. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Manhattan Projects or the Red Wing. Those are both series that Pitarra did with Jonathan Hickman. And the art, especially in Manhattan Projects, is just phenomenal. And there's kind of a fun freewheelingness to his style. And that definitely comes through with Leviathan. So this just came out today, August 1st, and it's something that I would highly recommend. I had a good time reading it.
So here's a completely non-scholarly question.
Sure.
How big is the Leviathan itself? The size of the monster makes a big difference.
It's about the size of a building.
Okay, that's good enough.
It steps on and bites into buildings.
All right, very good. That to me is immediately more satisfying.
Yes.
With my longing to see giant monsters destroy buildings.
Yeah. Well,
uninhabited buildings, of course, completely unoccupied in areas set for urban renewal. So right. Just let's be clear about that.
yeah. You don't want to hurt people.
No.
Now, the other issue that I was bringing up, Rob Guillory's Farmhand, is I think a little more substantive in what we have going on, and basically the premise we have there is we have who I assume will be the protagonist, a guy named Ezekiel Jenkins. He goes to see his father that he really hasn't seen in a long time. His father is Jedediah, and he takes his family, his wife and 2 kids. And so the kids, I think for the first time, or at least his younger son, gets to see his grandfather for the first time. Now, the thing that makes this so significant is that Jedediah is a farmer. And as he puts it at one point, and I want to read a passage from that first issue, he was visited by a light, and that light allowed him to see things in ways that he hadn't before. And basically what he sees is, I guess, the genetic makeup of what he would need to do in terms of harvesting human body parts. And so now he has turned his more traditional farm into a farm that basically grows livers, kidneys, hands, noses, and in fact, one of the things about the nose flowers is, as they say in this first issue, it's one of the only flowers that can smell you while you smell it.
That's pretty good.
And so, I mean, there is this humorous edge, a quite dramatic, so to speak, humorous edge in the Farmhand, like we have in Leviathan. And so, whereas Guillory and Layman together created a really fun and funny title, Chew, each of them on their own are doing titles that are, I think, in the vein of Chew, but again, unique. They're doing their own things. Now, this one passage that I mentioned, Jedediah says at one point, I was just plowing the back acreage when I saw it, a bright light, and all of a sudden, I knew things I had no way of knowing. I wrote down what I saw as fast as I could. It was like a map, but nothing like I'd ever seen. And then a doctor or a scientist comments on what Jedediah says and says what Jedediah had drawn out was essentially the blueprint for a new type of human stem cell, an intelligent cell that not only adapted to surrounding tissue, but seemed to instinctually know how tissue ought to be repaired. A cell with a sense of intelligent design, as it were. And so basically that, I think, on that one page, we have the premise of what's going on in the Farmhand. Now, toward the end of this first issue, there's someone who seems to be wanting to steal one of Jedediah's plants or body parts in order to take it back and to discover the secrets. In other words, there's competition, right, within this industry. And Jedediah says some foreboding things at the end of this first issue, which I guess is going to carry us on into the subsequent issues. But it seems to be a great premise, a fun series, really unusual, harvesting body parts in a way that is productive and helpful to human society instead of something on the black market. So, yeah, I'm excited about The Farmhand. I'm excited about Leviathan, and those are both recent titles coming out from Image.
It's interesting also that both are so rooted in genre as well. Monster and, I presume, science fiction and horror for The Farmhand.
Right, yeah. And there is something horrific about it, yeah. So I'm excited about both of those titles, and unfortunately, neither one of those have we had the time to discuss on the Comics Alternative. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring them up on this episode. Now, there's one other recent number one issue that I want to mention something about, because this is another title in the Berger Books imprint at Dark Horse, and it's something that seems interesting. It's by Christopher Cantwell and Martin Morazzo, She Can Fly, and the first issue of this came out on July 11th. And it's funny because when I saw this solicited, my assumption was the young woman who actually flies is going to be the protagonist, but it's not the case at all. The actual protagonist, at least according to this first issue, is a 15-year-old girl by the name of Luna. And Luna has some psychological issues. And in fact, when we first see her, she's talking to her psychiatrist or psychologist, a counselor, anyway, someone who's there to help her. And she's talking with the psychiatrist is talking with Luna about Luna's almost obsession with this woman who can fly. And so this is a phenomenon that's taking place in Chicago. All of a sudden every now and again, this woman appears in the sky. Really, no one knows anything about her, how she's able to do it, if she's part of some kind of government secret experiment that's going on. And so there are all these rumors that are going about. Well, Luna's fascinated by this woman, but we only see the flying woman from a distance, right? Again, Luna seems to be the protagonist here. And throughout this first issue, we see how disturbed Luna is, because as she engages with her parents, with her friends at school, with her grandmother, she fantasizes about committing these acts of violence, really, really nasty violent acts. But those are only fantasies that go on with her. So one of the things I'm curious about in subsequent issues is how this obsession with the flying woman is going to jibe with her delusions and her flights of violent fancy, so to speak. And so I'm curious how Cantwell's choice of using someone who's not psychologically stable as a filter to the flying woman is going to work. Now, curiously enough, and I don't think this is a spoiler at all, at one point, and this is about the middle of this first issue, the flying woman explodes. It's on the news, and so Luna is heartstruck because of this. I mean, she's downfallen. It seems to kind of shake her world. We don't know anything about not only the flying woman, but why she seemed to explode. Did she have a device with her, on her? No one knows. And the reader doesn't know, just as Luna and the authorities don't seem to know. So there's another character as well, someone who's living up in Saskatchewan. His name is Bill Meigs. And he seems to be associated with the phenomena of the flying woman in some way, but we're not really sure, at least in this first issue. So, again, this is another one of those issues that I think poses a number of questions, but they're good kind of questions that get me, at least as a reader, wanting to continue on.
So as a reader, here are 3 new series, all first issues, all of which are clearly setting up mysterious, long-running plots. How many of these different series can you follow for an extended period of time? And how do you make that decision about what you're going to continue to read? That's
a good question, and it's something that I addressed. I don't know if it was in the most recent episode of our weekly review show or in a previous episode, but one of the things I found, especially over the past few years, is I just don't have, or I don't take the time to follow up with series after the first 1 or 2 issues, as much as I would love to. And the main reason for that is because we've been doing more with the podcast over the past couple of years, I've had to do more reading in order to keep up.
Sure. And just the sheer explosion of titles, which
Yeah.
never seems to slow down at all.
Yeah. Now, there's some that I will make an effort to read subsequent issues of, those that really take me. But even with creators that I particularly love, and I'm looking right across to one of the racks here at Heroes, and I see various issues of Assassinistas. Another Teenie Howard title, Black Crown. Now, I liked the first issue, and I am a gigantic fan of the Hernandez brothers. Gilbert Hernandez does the art on that. Now, you would think that I would have kept up with Assassinistas. Unfortunately, I didn't, as much as I love Gilbert Hernandez, and I liked Teenie Howard's writing with Assassinistas. I wish I had, but I did get pre-order the trade of Assassinistas, so I do plan on going back after everything's collected. And really, that's basically what I do. So if I read a first issue of something, if I don't have the time or I don't take the time to read subsequent issues, then I trade wait.
Right. And I think this is where the experience of reading independent comics, to use that term loosely, and mainstream comics is really substantively different, because with mainstream comics, if you're reading a character like Captain America or Black Panther or Superman or whomever, you're stepping back into a narrative that has been going on for decades, and you immediately, whatever changes may have taken place in the character, wait, Captain America's a Hydra agent now? Whatever the changes may be, you're stepping back into a narrative that for readers of a certain generation, you know who you are, and you're hearing one speaking right now, are tied into just many, many decades of stories about the characters, which immediately gives you a kind of grounding in that world. And I think you can step in and out of that world and step in and out of those titles more easily than you can with independent series where the characters are all original characters, where there may be genre connections, but they're using genre trappings in a way other than to tell a story that simply adheres to sort of the familiar conventions of a story about a giant monster or a story about a mysterious farm creating fantasy products.
Yeah. And, one of the things about, I guess, loosely we can call them independent comics or non-mainstream,
Sure.
is that many times that they're limited series, right? So something like Assassinistas is going to be, I can't remember if it was 4 or 5 issues.
Right.
So it's relatively self-contained. So there's not the same kind of investment or commitment that you need to make as you would, let's say, with ongoing mainstream titles.
And there's an opportunity for the creators to tell a story that actually has a shape to it.
Right, yeah.
As opposed to the arcs, Secret Empire, or whatever the case may be, in the ongoing publishing histories of these characters who've been around for decades, where the arc may be relatively self-contained, but is still so deeply intertwined with so much history and the work of so many other creators, it will never be as self-contained and never be as shapely as an independent series can be.
Right. On the other hand, there are, in terms of non-mainstream publishers, titles that are, for all practical purposes, ongoing, even though there's an endpoint. And a great example that comes to mind is Saga.
Of course, yeah.
And so that's something that it does have an endpoint. It will end, and who knows, maybe within the next year and a half. But I can't remember what issue number we're up to right now.
I don't remember the issue number, but the most recent issue that came out, and I have not read it yet, however, I've read about it, and it is the culmination of another narrative arc leading up to a hiatus for the series that's going to be at least a year or so.
Oh, really?
And apparently represents a major turning point in the series. I tend to read that series in 12-issue, 7-issue chunks, whatever constitutes a narrative arc as it's defined by the creators themselves. So I'm looking forward to going back to that and seeing what sound like they are major developments in that series.
Huh. Okay, so this is interesting. It's going to take a hiatus of a year?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
I didn't hear about that. Now, I know that one of the things that Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples do is they take breaks or brief hiatuses of maybe a couple of months, and that's it. But this is going to be a year?
Yeah, it almost feels as if when you read the series that the different narrative arcs, sometimes radically shifting locations and putting the characters in very new situations, are almost tantamount to the equivalent of a season of an HBO drama or something like that. It feels in some ways, this may be a little bit cynical on my part, that it is almost written to be adapted to a medium like that. But obviously a very, very satisfying storytelling experience, too.
Yeah, and that's something that I used to keep up with on a fairly regular basis. I've fallen behind, and I need to keep up a little more because I really do enjoy that series. Another example of, let's say, series that are longer and you don't know how long they're going to go for, or kind of self-contained, relatively contained, I guess. I'm thinking of Terry Moore. Now, when he was writing Rachel Rising, which is a phenomenal series, I just loved it. I love Terry Moore's work, period. That was, I can't remember how many issues that was, but that was going on for quite a while, and we didn't know for the longest time how long it would go for. So that's one of those series, somewhat like Saga, that is, for all practical purposes, ongoing, and we don't have our sights, so to speak, on a particular endpoint. We don't know that there's going to be an end. On the other hand, we have his most recent series right now, Strangers in Paradise 25. And he has said that there will only be 12 issues for this series. So it's a substantive story, but we know that there's an endpoint within relative sight, so to speak. Yeah. So, again, psychologically, cognitively, it's not as if you have to commit yourself in ways that you would, let's say, to the superhero universes. Yeah. With the mainstream, it's like, okay, this is, I'm investing things for the long run, and who knows where the hell it's going or how long it'll last. With something like Strangers in Paradise 25, or even Assassinistas as another example, it's only going to be so many issues, and then that's it. You're done. Right,
absolutely. You had mentioned before that the She Can Fly title you were talking about is coming from Berger Books. So this is Karen Berger, the former editor of Vertigo, who is now working at Dark Horse, bringing out a line of books herself. Is that correct?
Exactly, yeah. And actually, Paul and I interviewed Karen Berger early this year. I can't remember if it was February or January, but it was early this year, and talked to her about the new line. This is right around the time that they launched it. And they started off with, I think, 3 titles, and she had even mentioned The Seeds, and so we had been anticipating The Seeds. It just took a little longer to come out, and the first issue of The Seeds came out just recently. But now we have also other books now. So she has a number of titles that have come out with the Berger Book imprint. I really like what she does as editor in general, but I think with the Berger Books imprint at Dark Horse, I think she's done a really good job. And it's really interesting to kind of juxtapose what Karen Berger is doing at Dark Horse with what Shelley Bond now is doing in terms of overseeing the Black Crown imprint at IDW, because, both of them were at Vertigo.
Oh, I didn't know so.
And I think both of them, in many ways, I don't want to suggest that Berger Books and Black Crown are derivative in any way, but they do have this Vertigo-ness to them. Yeah. And so I think with both the Black Crown titles that I've read, and I've read most of the things that have come out, at least number 1 issues of Black Crown, and I think the same thing with Berger Books, they definitely do have this Vertigo feel to them, and in many ways they're filling in the gap that Vertigo has left.
Sure.
And over the past several years have attempted to bring back to varying degrees of success. Now we're going to have pretty soon, I guess, a new wave of Vertigo titles, and so I'm curious to see what those are like. And maybe we can even devote an entire episode to those new Vertigo titles. I don't know. But
Well, looking back at the history of Karen Berger's work and at Vertigo itself, and we were talking before about a comic series that has a definite endpoint. I think one of the things that was sort of a paradigm for that was Neil Gaiman's work with Sandman, where it was surprising and satisfying to see that series, at least until he returned to it in various ways, was itself self-contained and had an actual endpoint to it.
Yeah, and one of the things that strikes me about that is with both Sandman and with Swamp Thing, I mean, these started I mean, these were big Vertigo titles, but they began in those incarnations before Vertigo.
Exactly. Sure.
So they just transitioned into Vertigo
Alan
titles.
Moore and Neil Gaiman, who really created the template for that.
Yeah, exactly.
Alan Moore in particular.
Yeah. Now, are you a fan of the Sandman narratives?
Yeah, I enjoyed the series quite a bit. I read the last revival of it that he did with J.H. Williams and thought it was beautiful Overture,
yeah.
and I can't tell you a damn thing about the story.
Yeah.
I'm sure it was very good, but it was beautiful artwork.
Beautiful artwork, and I'm like you, I've forgotten it. Of course, it's been like 2 or 3 years since I read Overture, but are you looking forward to, I guess, the Sandman universe that's coming out from DC?
Well, never let a good concept or a good franchise die. Not really, actually. I might take a look at it. It just feels like... and this is shocking in the world of mainstream comics, so just hold on to your seat. It feels like an effort to just kind of reap commercial dividends from a successful character and successful narrative. I don't know if that should be shocking or not, but just in case it is, I just wanted to warn people. Consider that a trigger warning in your podcast.
I feel, I guess, somewhat similar. When I first saw the announcement for the Sandman universe, I was automatically cynical.
Yeah.
For the reasons
and Gaiman
that
is
you
not
mentioned.
actually writing it. He is...
I think he's overseeing the plotting.
Yeah.
Maybe in a loose way, and then others are just writing the specifics
yeah.
of the story, and then...
Well, he's a struggling writer, so you got to do something to get by.
So, on the one hand, I'm fascinated by what this will be. On the other hand, there is that cynical side of me. It's like, do we need this? Do we need to return to the same properties over and over again? Can't we have something new? But as this is going on...
Well, the mainstream comics, of course, is built on the idea that we do return to the same properties over and over again. They can always be rebooted and brought out again with a new number one.
Right, but the thing that distinguishes Sandman from, let's say, DC proper is that he both is and isn't part of the DC universe.
Correct,
they work him into the DC universe, but really he's much more of a Vertigo-esque figure.
Yeah.
And, I don't know, in my book, I would like it if they separate Vertigo from the DC universe, and at times they don't do that.
And I think the publishing initiative is going in exactly the opposite direction.
Yeah, and case in point, Hellblazer. Hellblazer, Vertigo character as far as I'm concerned, but they brought him into the DC universe. And I think when they did that with the New 52 around that time, that's where they lost me.
Yeah.
When they ended, the original, I guess it was about a year and a half after they started the New 52, when they ended the initial Hellblazer run and then brought it back, but as a DC proper title. I don't know. I've read a few issues, but I don't know. It's just not
although,
the
to
same.
be fair, the original Alan Moore run on Swamp Thing, one of the great comic runs of any series ever, was firmly grounded in the DC universe, and John Constantine regularly interacted with characters like Dr. Fate and the Spectre going back to the 1940s. So, in some ways, the presentation of those characters now is not really a violation, although what it represents is, as DC has been doing since about 1986, is strip mining the ideas of Alan Moore.
Yeah.
Please don't stop, or do stop. I'm not sure which is the right response.
Well, the thing with Hellblazer, and I think I've said this on the podcast 1 or 2 times before, is John Constantine doesn't strike me as a team player, definitely.
No.
Yet, when they brought him in as part of Justice League Dark, he became a team player.
Sure.
And it just didn't seem a good fit. And maybe I'm just an old fogey. I want my old Hellblazer. I want my old Constantine. Well, yeah, I do.
Well, there are just ways of telling different kinds of stories about the same character. I think when you look at Hellblazer as a series, one of the things that I've recently gone back to, when I have time to reread old things, is Garth Ennis's run on the series, which was a terrific, powerful run. But my first introduction to Constantine, when he was first created, was as a character firmly set in that universe. Interesting little footnote, you can probably still search this out and find it online, is the rejected proposal that Alan Moore put together when he was working at DC in an early phase of his career for a massive crossover. with ideas that were sort of like what eventually became Kingdom Come by Alex Ross and Mark Waid. And John Constantine is a major player in that. It would be a fascinating series to actually see if someone somehow could find a way to actually turn that into a series.
Now, did you watch that only one season TV series, Constantine?
I did,
What'd you think of it?
It was okay. It was okay. I mean, it was a good enough actor playing the part, and there were aspects of it that seemed faithful to the character. Yeah, it was okay. Yeah, like most television adaptations of comics are.
I liked that, and it was sad that it only lasted one season. And I heard at one point that maybe CW would pick it up, but I guess they never got around to it.
I'm trying to remember the name of the actor who played Constantine in that. But he has since returned to that role, and the character has been integrated into, I think, some of the CW series. He has appeared in the one whose name I'm going to forget, which has a bunch of characters traveling through time, Legends of Tomorrow.
That's right, yeah.
There we go. He's appeared in that.
Okay.
And is being integrated back into that universe.
Okay, so they are making use of the figure and the actor who played Constantine in some way. On the topic of, and maybe this is a way of getting back to Marvel, on the topic of television adaptation, since we last talked back in early July, I have since seen the second season, I binged it, the second season of Jessica Jones.
Oh, okay.
On Netflix.
Yet, yeah.
Have you seen the first season?
I did see the first season. I thought that was one of the more successful adaptations. Though all of the Netflix series, I think, go on too long.
Yeah, well,
they drag in the middle.
Yeah. Now, I like the 2 seasons of Daredevil that I've seen. The thing about Daredevil, though, that kind of bugged me, and I'm not a prude when it comes to violence in any way, but I just thought that there was too much fighting and too much violence, at least for me. Now, I've heard...
There were some great set-piece sequences in the early episodes of the series, one that was done in a single take with a fight in the hallway that was really pretty remarkable to watch, but it did become repetitious after a while.
It did, and I've heard people make the argument that there is something rather poetic and balleric. I mean, I don't know what the adjective would be there. Balletic. In that, and that's fine. I just didn't enjoy it. Yeah. I just thought it was too much and too repetitious. In other words, after a while I thought during a particular fight scene, okay, I get it. I know what they're doing now, and I know they're beating the crap out of each other. Do we have to continue on with this? How about give me more story content and not just the fight? Yeah. But a lot of people like those kind of action scenes, and I guess I can understand that. I definitely didn't get that sense with either the first or now the second season of Jessica Jones. Yeah. I thought that they were both really well done. This second season is markedly different from the first, but in a good way. So I think it stands on its own. Although there are parts of the second season, especially toward the later episodes, that harken back to what goes on in the first season, especially with Mr. Purple, played by David Tennant.
Yeah.
So because David Tennant makes appearances in this second season, but as Spirit.
Right, and his performance as Kilgrave, the Purple Man, in the first season is probably, well, I'll say one of the best portrayals of a comic book villain that I've seen in film or television.
Yeah.
That was a truly compelling character. His performance was fabulous.
It was. Now, have you seen Luke Cage?
I saw a couple of episodes of that and just could not quite commit.
It's interesting because I think when it first came out, when the first season came out last year, I believe it was, I watched the first 1 or 2 episodes, and it didn't hook me. And then what I did, I think it was early this year, or maybe late last year, is I gave it a second shot. And so I rewatched those first 2 episodes, and then got into the third, fourth, so on. And then it hooked me. And so it took a while.
Yeah. So I just haven't been able to make that commitment to a series like that for quite some time, but that's my own personal failing more than anything else.
Yeah, but now the second season of Luke Cage is out, so I'd really like to see that. Yeah. And I'm not a big Punisher fan by any means, but I liked that first Netflix season of Punisher.
Yeah, I saw the episodes of Daredevil that featured him in the second season.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember the name of the actor who plays the Punisher, but I thought that was the best incarnation on film I've seen of the Punisher as a character.
Because didn't,
yeah, there were a couple of different Punisher films. The first one was with Dolph Lundgren. Dolph, where are you now? And the second was with an actor named Ray Stevenson, who originally appeared on HBO's series Rome, a really interesting actor, and then later was buried in massive makeup for a few brief scenes as Volstagg in the Thor films.
Okay.
If we're going down the rabbit hole here of comics and film trivia.
Well, I am way behind in terms of my Marvel Universe film watching. And in fact, I think the last one I saw, to tell you how late I am on this or how behind I am, was the first Avengers.
Oh, wow, you are behind.
I'm really behind.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen anything, I don't think, since then. I intend to, but I just haven't gotten around to it yet. It's a matter of time.
The films I keep up with very closely, they are the realization of childhood dreams for me. But I think they're, by and large, very successful adaptations. I think the last round of films with Black Panther in particular, Doctor Strange, Captain America, Civil War, Infinity War, have all been really well done adaptations. Thor Ragnarok. Adaptations that are unafraid to embrace the most hyperbolic, exaggerated aspects of comic books. Thor Ragnarok in particular, with its costume design and set design that is just avowedly a realization of the designs of Jack Kirby, is terrific in that way. These films are really absorbing not only bits and pieces of the characters' histories over many decades and reassembling those in interesting ways, but increasingly really adopting the sort of dynamic visual quality, the wildly exaggerated cosmic quality of Marvel comic books, and DC by extension as well.
Now, what do you think of the DC films?
They are misguided. And I think the problem with the DC films is that whoever was in charge at Warner Brothers or Time Warner looked at the success of what Christopher Nolan did with his Batman films and said every film is going to be like this. And then they made...
dark?
Yeah, they were all going to be dark. They were all going to aim for that tone, which is great that one filmmaker can do that, but to make that a house style, I think, is absolutely an error. And, of course, their greater error, I don't want to heap too much blame on him, was to hire Zack Snyder as the architect of that universe. Snyder is kind of an interesting visual stylist, but go watch some of his earlier films. There was one about beautiful women in a kind of video game setting that tanked at the box office right around the time they decided to hand the Superman franchise to him. The title of this film will come back to me, no doubt, 10 minutes after we turn off the microphones. And it's just baffling that they chose him as a director. Although I have to admit, I've argued with myself about this many times and argued with my daughter about this as well, that I actually kind of like Man of Steel. It's over the top in a lot of ways, but there are moments in it that actually, to me, are kind of satisfying. I'll stand by that no matter the controversy.
Now, I did see that, and I remember I went to see it when it opened because at the time a friend of mine worked at a comic shop, and he had his hands on some extra tickets and gave me one, so that was cool.
Yeah.
So I went to see it, and the thing that bugged me about that film is that it was made for 3D, and if you didn't see it in 3D, which I didn't, then there are parts of it that seemed to be... I mean, it made sense to me, but it was annoying because I know that when certain things are flying toward the camera, it's supposed to be for the 3D. But again, I wasn't watching it in 3D. I prefer not to watch films in 3D because I don't like something on my face as I'm watching TV. I mean, my glasses are bad enough as it is.
Well, and it's 20% darker, the image anyway.
Yeah, and so that kind of annoyed me. Yeah. But, other than that, I thought it was okay. I probably didn't like it as much as you do.
And that was clearly a reflection of the studio's decision to say, we want all of these films to be like a Christopher Nolan film. Mm-hmm. Nolan was one of the executive producers of that film, and so you see a little bit of his imprint there. screenwriter, Batman Begins, and forgive me, names are escaping me today, was also the principal screenwriter for that. Lost it.
Again, you'll remember as soon as we cut off the microphone. Yeah. I'm behind in my movie going. I'm behind in my television watching.
Well, while we're talking about superheroes and in all of their incarnations, let me do a shout out to something which came out just today, which, if you have a big enough budget and you're an old-time comics fan, an old-time Marvels fan, you have to take a look at. And that is another of the IDW artist editions. This one is Jack Kirby's Marvels and Monsters, reprinting some of Kirby's superhero work for Marvel, including an issue of Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos, and several stories that ran in Marvel's monster titles, Tales of Suspense, Journey into Mystery. To see Kirby's artwork in this format is just absolutely astonishing. To see the quality of the line work, the scope of the artwork is, like I say, absolutely astonishing. No pun intended, and definitely worth seeking out. The artist editions, as I mentioned before, are a particular addiction of mine. But they're also dangerous, too.
They're an expensive addiction.
They're expensive, and they are physically dangerous. So as I've learned recently by trying to carry around too many of those big, oversized art books at one time, that can be actually injurious to your person. So watch out for that, too.
Yeah, I only have 2 of those, and both of those are the Spirit.
Yeah, those are great ones.
Yeah. So, it's interesting that you mentioned this new Kirby volume. Now, is it only... this artist edition, is it only his Marvel work?
It's only the Marvel work.
Okay. And the reason I mention that or ask about that is just recently I started to listen, or in some ways kind of re-listen, to a brand new podcast that you may be interested in if you're a big Kirby fan. And in fact, my co-host for the Comics Alternative, the regular weekly show, Paul Lai, he and a colleague of his that he had worked with at Multiversity called Matt Loon have started a podcast called Motherbox.
Nice.
And what they're doing is they're devoting a podcast just to the Fourth World, just to Kirby's Fourth World. And so as they read through, and I think both of them are reading through the Fourth World series or the various comics, the titles that make up the Fourth World for the first time. I mean, they've heard about it, but they're reading it for the first time, and they plan on having, some Kirby scholars, people who are much more familiar with the Fourth World, on as guests. And they just recently, I think, released a second episode. So that's another podcast that, Mike, you may want to check out, being a Kirby fan, and I think our listeners as well. It's called Motherbox.
Yeah, there are a couple of IDW editions of Kirby's DC work on the Fourth World interrelated set of series. The New Gods one is just absolutely stunning to see his work that way.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, because my co-host Paul told me he was going to start this, I decided to begin reading the Fourth World series myself. And I've been lax over the past month in terms of getting to it. But years ago, when DC put out the 4 individual hardback volumes, I guess mini omnibi, not the one omnibus that has come out relatively recently.
Ones you can actually hold in your hand.
Exactly, and not break your back.
Yes.
I got those years ago when they first came out in anticipation of reading them, and then never got around to them. Now I'm starting to get to them, and I need to get back. I mean, I need to find the time to do that. But it is a really interesting and wild ride, and part of the wildness is embedded in the time in which it was created, right?
Absolutely,
So, and you have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, late 1960s, early 70s.
Yeah, so a lot of that cheesiness and the weirdness,
right.
Their vehicle called the Whiz Wagon, I mean, there were a lot of jokes that you could make about that.
What? I don't understand.
Yeah, but, I'm willing to go with it. So, I'm would like to read along with Matt and Paul and then continue to listen to their podcast. So that's something you may want to check out.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah.
Pure Kirby crackle.
Well, Mike, I think we've reached about the end of this first August On Location episode, and we want to thank the people at Heroes Aren't Hard to Find for letting us come into their shop and take up some space. Unfortunately, we didn't have any customers come in who wanted to talk to us, but hey, we had a good time, just the two of us, talking about both mainstream and non-mainstream titles that have come out recently. And again, heroes aren't hard to find. They're located at 417 Pecan Avenue in Charlotte, North Carolina. If you're in the area, if you're visiting Charlotte, you definitely should check them out. There's no better comic shop in the area. That's Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. And then after you do visit Heroes, or, read some of the comics that Mike and I have been discussing on this On Location episode, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about our discussion. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can contact me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And Mike, if people wanted to contact you, how do they do so?
It is Michael at comicsalternative.com.
And we're all over...
Pseudonym.
That's right. Yeah. We're all over social media, so you can send us messages and get in touch on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the Comics Alternative through Apple Podcast. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to the website, comicsalternative.com. Now, Mike, you and I plan on being back here in a couple of weeks.
That's correct.
So that'll be our second August episode, and we look forward to that. So you
no
guys,
idea what's coming out then, but it'll be something interesting.
Yeah, we'll talk about new stuff, and it's fun. I like these shows. I like the new format of what we're doing on location, and so thanks a lot.
All right, thanks, guys.
So we'll be back later this month. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Mike.
Take care.